Hello, and welcome to another episode of Decentralounge, brought to you by Global Stake, your institutional, truly decentralized, self-owned and managed SOC 2 Type 2 compliant bare metal staking service provider. Welcome to today's episode, the first of season 3. We're excited to bring to you today, and we're delighted to have Sam Williams, the visionary co-founder and CEO of Arweave, joining us. Arweave is revolutionizing the blockchain space with novel approach to permanent, low-cost, and truly decentralized data storage. Prior to starting Arweave, Sam honed his expertise in computer science with a specific focus on distributed systems, which laid the foundational knowledge necessary to tackle some of the most pressing issues in data permanence. His academic pursuits and early career experiences greatly influenced his entrepreneurial journey, leading to the creation of Arweave. Sam is also a mentor for Techstars and a technical advisor for MindSpider. Under Sam's leadership, Arweave isn't just a storage solution, it's a platform that promises a new paradigm for data preservation, content publishing, and developer opportunities in the decentralized web space. Join us as we delve into the innovative world of Arweave, explore the impact of permanent data storage, and discuss Sam's vision for the future of decentralized data. Again, Sam, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you here today. Why don't we just start off, like we do with every guest, tell us a little bit about the journey into this space. What brought you to this land of blockchain and Web3, and what kind of brought around the vision of Arweave?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for having me on. It'll be fun to chat. So I got started looking at blockchains in around 2010, approximately. It was like very, very early. I don't know precisely the date. It was when Bitcoin was worth around 3 cents. Which, you know, at the time it just looked like magic internet money. And the cool thing was BitTorrent, right? BitTorrent at that time was a third of the internet's traffic, something like this. And I thought that incentive mechanism underneath it, bit swapping, basically, optimistic tit for tat, they called it, was super, super interesting from a distributed systems design point of view. Yeah, so I sort of played around with it then. Oh, actually, no, at that time I saw a friend using it. I was like, okay, this is interesting, man, but like, let's get on with our lives. And then it was 2012 before I really looked into it again. And by that time, there was some work starting to be done on alternate consensus mechanisms, which I thought was also pretty interesting. It was very, very basic. It was like, I think they called it Feathered Coin was possibly the first proof of stake mechanism, but it was flawed proof of stake. I'm not sure if anyone ever exploited it, but it didn't work properly. Anyway, but it was interesting. And then it was 2017 when I was just finishing up my, well, would have been PhD. That's the finishing stage. When I came up with the idea for Arweave, which was basically, well, that thing you could do with Bitcoin, and people were doing it way, way, way before ordinals. They don't, you know, that's a lost part of the history now, but encoding data inside a blockchain was done since right at the start, and people thought it was an interesting idea. They experimented with it. There were these things called colored coins, which actually were quite close to early NFTs. Yeah, I thought all of that was super interesting. And I was looking around the world and I saw that there was a need for some sort of data preservation mechanism that guaranteed its availability in many different jurisdictions simultaneously, and also outside the hands of any one individual or party that was, you could say, the custodian of the data. And I saw, okay, well, blockchains offer half the solution here, but the consensus mechanisms don't lend themselves to data storage on chain. How do we make that scale? And well, that was the problem we set about solving when we built permanent data at arbitrary scale. And the first use case we had in mind was storing newspaper articles, because we thought that essentially, you know, if you imagine what that permanent ledger of speech and history could look like, what better than to store news so that you get this neutral, non-commercialized even. It's just like a neutral, open, public good protocol that stores humanity's history. And that should obviously be done through the preservation of reports of what's happening in the world. But once we built that, we realized, well, if you can store, so there, you know, that's expressed in web pages nowadays, right? Well, if you have a neutral permanent store for web pages, and you can serve it to people's browsers, that is actually a permanent decentralized web. And that was where the idea from the perm web was born. Basically taking content from the existing web and making it so that you can browse around it in this, like directly from a blockchain. And not only could you browse around existing data, but you could even launch applications that were fully on-chain, web applications and services that were subsequently imbued with the properties of blockchains. Right? So if there's a perm web app that looks like Twitter, for example, then when you use it on top of Arweave, your right to speak is not at the behest of any individual person. It's neutrally given to you by the protocol. And your right to access that information is the same. So you get protocolized rights for web services, basically. And that was the idea for the perm web. We started building Arweave back in early 2017. It's been nearly, so like, oh yeah, we had the 6th anniversary of mainnet a few months ago. So it's been a decent amount of time now. And we're coming up to 10 billion pieces of information stored inside it, which is pretty cool. It's growing at about a billion a month. And for some context, like the indexed part of the centralized web, so the part that you can get through typically Google or Baidu, or Bing, if you're esoteric, perhaps. That's about 40 to 50 billion pieces of information. So we're around like 20 to 25% of the centralized web at this point, in terms of the amount of data that's indexed and available through it. There's a long way to go, but yeah, we are very, if you plot the exponential path, we are relatively close to building a fully decentralized web of equivalent size and scope.
That's wild and insane. And congratulations on all of the hard work and the accomplishments you guys have done over the last 6.5 years since mainnet. I am kind of curious where the name Arweave comes from.
Okay, so originally it was called Archain because it was the archiving chain. It makes sense, pretty basic. But at the time, there were a few different projects. Well, for a start, the core technology was actually a block weave. It's not really a blockchain. It takes the so I say a pointer, that's not quite right. Cryptographic hash, one way or another, of a prior block, includes it in the production of a next block, just like a blockchain, but also it includes, well, first it was a full block from the history. Now it's actually a chunk from a prior block and loops that into the production of the next block, which makes this sort of weaving structure. So yeah, it was kind of weird then that it was called Archain. That was like, what would you say, brand incongruence. And also at the time when we started it, there were 2 other projects, one called A-Chain and one called R-Chain with just the R, but we used to call it R-Chain so that we can differentiate ourselves from it. And that wasn't going to work. They were relatively large projects at the time. And so we thought, well, okay, why don't we just fix that incongruence? And that's how we got from R-Chain to Arweave. And funny enough, the thing that really threw it in the end was you can write Arweave on your keyboard with one hand, your left hand only. Now it's like, oh yeah, okay. We're going to write this like billions of times over the next decades, maybe centuries. Let's make it something that's at least easy to write. And that was what threw it in the end.
That's such a cool story, and I had to glance down, and I could totally see it too. Just the Arweave with your left hand only. When I first read the white paper, I found the entire structure, and I'm the least technical person on the team, but I love things like conceptually, and just there's a beauty and an elegance to Arweave's design. And one of the things you were talking about, this permanence on the Arweave storage protocol itself, you know, there's in the paper, it talks about how like the initial, when you put something on there, you're pretty much guaranteed at least 200 years of storage. So maybe we could spend some time digging into like the thought behind like the structure to Arweave itself, and just to let the audience know a little bit more about how the protocol itself works.
Yeah, for sure. So the storage endowment structure, the 200 years thing is it's something of a meme. Like it represents something that is accurate, but the way that most people use it is not quite in line with what it actually means. Basically, when you pay for storage in Arweave, you pay for 200 years worth of storage. But we observed that, well, okay, so you fix scalability of blockchains for data storage. That's part one. as soon as you solve that problem, you've landed yourself in another, potentially even larger problem, which is, well, how do you pay for it then? Right? Because a blockchain that only adds a megabyte of data every 10 minutes is kind of okay because it's an ever-growing ledger. So it's an ever-growing burden of data storage, but it will only increase at a certain rate. And that rate is relatively low. So it's not ever going to become a real problem. But as soon as you have like a seriously scalable, like arbitrarily scalable data storage system inside a blockchain, now you have an ever-growing ledger and you have to have some means to pay for it. So we looked at this and we thought, well, the only mechanism that could ever really make sense for something like this is an endowment, right? You have to take some value, create more value than you're going to consume of it within a time period, and then take the remainder, the principal, and pass it forward and do the same again, over and over again. That's really the only sustainable structure for something like this. But then we were looking at it and thinking, well, okay, great, but how do you go and get the yield in a reliable way? And how much yield do you need? And we realized that actually, interestingly, there is yield accessible in terms of storage purchasing power, simply by being able to transmit value over time. And this is true of certain other properties like computation to a lesser extent, but it's definitely there. Also data transmission. So if you had $200 in the year 2000 and you wanted to transmit some data with it, well, you could transmit some amount of data. But if you keep that $200 and you manage to maintain its value to 2024, you can transmit much, much more, exponentially more, in fact, in that case. And so we looked back at the history of, you could say, the cost in human labor and, well, broadly speaking, value. But it goes even back further than money, we think. How much value does it take to encode data? Right? And you look, well, okay, humans started by encoding it like on the side of cave walls. So how long did it take someone to encode a single character? And how much data is that in, modern binary terms? It's like they really had to work at it just to transmit across time a very small amount of data. And then over time, there seems to have been this inherent push inside humans, this incentive to make that process more and more efficient. And this was true when we got to, for example, the printing press, right? At which point the cost of data encoding and transmission over time declined massively. The same was true with the advent of digital computers. And since that point, the average storage cost decline rate per year has been 38.5%, which is really astonishing. So we thought that was interesting, but well, the past doesn't necessarily predict the future, right? So what are the things that might stop that happening in the future? One of them is perhaps there's no incentive to do it, right? Like maybe it's possible, which we'll get to in a second, but maybe people just don't want to. And then we looked at this carefully and said, well, pretty much everything in human life, like the difference between humans and monkeys fundamentally is that they attempt to create tools and optimize those tools. And part of the process of optimizing tools is the transmission of information. Like most of the people listening to this podcast to some extent will be doing so because they want to gain new tools in the form of thinking tools or memes, as Susan Blackmore called them, ways of thinking about the world in order to be more effective as a human. Right? This is all about data transmission and encoding. So we think there's a very strong incentive. And AI, by all estimations at this point, approximations, will be more data hungry than even we humans will be. So heavy incentive to optimize. And then if you look at, okay, so where are we in the process of reaching any sort of theoretical maximum point of data encoding efficiency? And long story short, if you look at the numbers, we're at about 10 to the power 13 bits per cubic centimeter in data encoding, whereas the theoretical limit, I believe it's called the Planck. No, it's not the Planck constant, it's a derivation from Planck equations. But anyway, it's about 10 to the power 64 bits per cubic centimeter. So we have an enormous amount to go. And we calculated, okay, so even if we continued at that like extraordinarily high rate of 38.5%, compounding each year, how long would it take us to get to that maximum? And we worked out that was about 450, 434, I think, years away. Now, we don't think that it's going to continue going at 38.5%. It's likely to come in these like step functions. Yeah, but we're pretty sure that it's going to stay above 0.5%. And that's where the 200 years comes from. Actually, 200 years is, so you pay for 200 years, yes, but that means if the price of storage declines at a rate of, on average, 0.5% per year, then you end up at the end of each given year with as much storage purchasing power as you had at the start. And so there we go. That's why 200 years is a mean. So it's 200 years, but really it's that part of the mechanism never breaks as long as the cost of storage purchasing power goes down in AR terms at a rate above 0.5%.
Well, I mean, you mentioned AI and just the data consumption, everything else. I didn't really expect this to take sort of a kind of quasi-philosophical turn. That was really interesting, thinking about data transmission through human history in this way. But speaking about AI and the next sort of evolutionary leap, if you will, with what Arweave is building out, of course, is AO and sort of a kind of hyper-parallelized supercomputer on top of the data structure that has been built. If Arweave is sort of the substrate for all of it, then AO is sort of this emergent thing that you're building on top now that is going to use the data that's in Arweave. And as it continues to grow, I would assume that AO is going to only become more powerful over time. And there's already agents that are acting on AO right now. So just curious to maybe tell the audience a little bit more about AO, what the grand vision of that is, and how this connects to Arweave and everything else. Where is this all going?
Yeah, so this came as a bit of a surprise to us. We didn't realize this when building Arweave. I wouldn't say it's like some grand design, but we observed that, well, if you have permanent data storage in a decentralized environment, so that data is available from many nodes, there's no single centralized point of failure, and you have decentralized amendments, additions, basically, to the ledger, then you have the basis of decentralized computation at arbitrary scale too. Because if you have a verifiable deterministic machine, right, something where you put in 1, 2, 4, it always gives you 11 or whatever computation is happening. It's deterministic, same inputs, same outputs each time. Yeah, then you can rerun the execution. And so you don't actually need a decentralized computer to do computation, interestingly. What you need it to do is to maintain a ledger of the inputs to computation, because from those inputs, if you have a deterministic virtual machine, you imply the outputs. And so this is a little bit like deep in the computer science weeds, but basically the output of this is that you can have an arbitrarily scalable decentralized supercomputer, because you can attach many different machines to validating parts of the computation. And in AO, to some extent, we just did the obvious thing, which, crypto has so many cults and cargo cults. Sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees. But if you want to scale a system in Web 2, what you do is not like try and add more computation to a single thread of execution and make that go faster. That's what we call vertical scaling. Instead, what you do is you break up the computation into many different parts that can be run in parallel. And then you let those parts, we call them processes, send information between each other. We call those messages. And because we have this arbitrarily horizontally scalable data storage system, that's essentially a decentralized message bus that doesn't have a capacity. So you can send messages between different processes at any scale. And that means you can write into their logs of those interactions, those computations at any scale. And yeah, the result is then you just attach computers to the computation units that you have, basically the processes, and you resolve state and you say, oh, okay, this process needs to send a message to another process. And you just run the whole system like this. And so if you're kind of used to the EVM world, or like I can explain this. EVM world, think of each of those processes like a rollup. except they're running a WebAssembly environment typically, although it could be EVM or SVM or whatever you want. Actually, the protocol is agnostic to the virtual machine. Yeah, but it's kind of like a rollup. And then those rollups have a built-in messaging layer, a bridging network, essentially, that is Arweave. And so they can communicate with one another. Instead of having like about a dozen rollups, as there are in the Ethereum ecosystem that have any usage, there are, I should have checked before we got on, but typically on an average day, about 9,000 to 12,000 different processes running in parallel on top of AO today. And that's just the test net. The point is, once you have that arbitrarily scalable message bus, and you commoditize the different parts of the stack. So we call them messaging units, the things that ferry those messages around, compute units, the things that resolve the state, and scheduling units, things that assign a slot number. So something becomes before something else on this process. If you commoditize those layers of the stack, yeah, then you can run these things at arbitrary scale. Sum it up, it's a world computer, basically, but actually like a real one this time. Oh, that was yeah, something I missed. I was in the Ethereum ICO way back, and that really affected me in a way. Like I bought like $20, I think, or $14 or $20 worth of ETH in the ICO, because I thought that like, oh, okay, this is a cool idea. I want some, I'll just like buy the compute credits I would have otherwise got from Amazon to run a server for a month. And then I'll do some computation in a decentralized supercomputer. That would be cool. And that was in 2013, 2014. And I'm still waiting for my world computer. In the end, we gave up waiting. We just built one. But it really is an attempt to actually create. Yeah, Ethereum did a lot of good. It was a very cool design for achieving decentralized finance on a single thread, right? Like everyone coming to consensus about state changes and having general purpose computation happen. It was a very, very cool prototype. And it yielded such an immense amount of activity. It's really astonishing. But like it never got past that prototype phase. And so AO is just our attempt essentially to do it like they said in the marketing material in 2014, just with a design that actually scales this time.
Well, that sounds amazing. I mean, we have a couple minutes left. I mean, is there things that are coming beyond AO that maybe you want to share with the audience, or just future trends that you're excited about, anything like that?
Yeah, so we think that AO has increased the usage of Arweave massively since its launch earlier this year. It's really like, if you look at the numbers, quite astonishing. So we think that a lot of the near-term use of the system will be at least partially driven by that, like onboarded by that. And so there's lots of things in that area that we're really excited about, like people building fully autonomous on-chain worlds, things that are basically like potentially fully 3D MMOs running with the game server being inside a decentralized environment this time, which is super cool. Or the AgentFi economy. So essentially we see that, well, now we can put real AI on chain. We're not talking about like the play models that are very small, or models that are off chain just reporting their data on chain. No, like AI models, LLMs, like Llama 3, 8 billion parameter inside a smart contract. Once you can do stuff like that, which we have done already, we had that in like early May, something, I think. Anyway, yeah, then you can have essentially AI-driven financial strategies that have the same trustlessness properties that you would expect from a typical smart contract. And that's really, really interesting, because if you look at the way that the financial markets are structured, you see that there's basically two things happening. There's people designing games. That's things like, at the basic level, swaps or loans or options, and then it gets more and more complex. But yeah, economic games, something that expresses a sort of logical world set of axioms, and then ways to play inside it, moves that people can take. And these are the primitives. And this is what DeFi succeeded in making trustless. And that in itself is just extremely, extremely interesting and exciting, because it means you can obviously have financial services without trust. But when you look at how people interact with the financial markets, well, that's a whole different layer. That's the intelligence layer of the market, right? And DeFi did nothing so far to make that trustless. So normally when people take part in capital allocation, they do so through a proxy of some form. Like most money in the world is not allocated by someone looking at a specific opportunity and saying, yes, I should take part in that. Most of the money is actually allocated through, one way or another, delegation to someone that is going to manage or amortize risk on behalf of someone else. And all of those strategies, and they're still the things that, many people in crypto, they manage their own money, but lots of the money that is moving around now is in this form of delegated control. Yeah, we can now make that layer itself, that is making intelligent decisions about how to allocate capital, trustless too, so that we open up the playing field. It becomes permissionless. Anyone can build a good strategy and launch it on the system, as an anonymous account on Twitter in their mother's basement or whatever. And no one has to trust them because it's just code, and they can still lend their capital to it, and it can make autonomous, intelligent decisions where the initial developer is not a trusted party. On people's behalf, they can lend money to it and take that capital out. And we think that that alone would be huge. It's a whole new playground, basically, for people to build in. And there's just like a couple of things I'm excited about.
Well, Sam, thank you for your time today. I could honestly sit here and listen for the next 17 hours. Just everything is wildly fascinating to me. We need to get you on Joe Rogan for a 3-hour podcast. But for anybody that's listening, that are builders, that want to take action, where would you recommend that they go, other than, I guess, the perfect starting place is arweave.org, but where would you recommend they reach out to you or your team?
Arweave.org. If you want to reach my team, go to fwd.ar.io, and of course that's on the Perma web, so you can replace ar.io with arweave.net, arweave.dev, gateway.io, whatever you want. It's decentralized. And reach out to us there, or check out the AO the Computer Twitter account. There's also the Arweave Eco Twitter account, which, yes, still centralized, but it aggregates a bunch of information from other teams in the ecosystem. Arweave's really decentralized at this point, so I can't point you to one place and say, here's where all the news is. But that's about as close as you can get. And other than that, Arweave is the Arweave.org, the main site, and Arweave Hub. And if you Google it, you'll find us. And AO has a fair launch as well of its token supply, which is people are finding interesting. There's about $500 million of liquidity locked inside, waiting for the launch of AO, which is in a few months, February 9th. And you can find that at ao.arweave.dev or ao.ar.io. You get the picture by now.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. For those of you that are listening, everything will be linked in the description. Thank you again for your time today, Sam. Wildly fascinating. So excited for what you guys are building. Can't wait to see the future of this massive, real, decentralized supercomputer. Thank you again for tuning into another episode of Decentraland, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for
Take
having
care,
me on.
everyone.
See you.